In the brutal winter of 1885, when the bighorn winds howled like grieving spirits, a lone Lakota warrior dragged a sled heavy with firewood through blinding snow toward a crumbling Catholic orphanage. Inside, 17 starving children clung to life, watched over by a former battlefield nurse who still carried a Colt under her habit. He came to repay a debt no one thought could ever be settled. She opened the door to a ghost from her bloodiest night. What began as a silent delivery of life-saving supplies ended with a gunshot that echoed across the frozen valley, and a reunion that would rewrite the meaning of family forever. One wagon, one bullet, one little girl who was never supposed to survive. Listen to the end, and you'll understand why some debts are paid not with gold, but with a father's heartbeat finally finding its way home. If this moved you even a little, hit subscribe, share where you're listening from, and stay until the final word. The real miracle is waiting in the silence after the storm. The wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains like a living thing with teeth. December 1885 had already killed 2 prospectors on the trail and frozen the little bighorn solid enough to ride across. Yet the real killing cold was the kind that slipped inside a man's ribs and stayed there. At the edge of a shallow valley, the St. Helena orphanage crouched beneath a roof of crusted snow, its bell silent, its crucifix black against the white. Sister Eleanor Kane stood in the pantry that had become a tomb. 1 sack of weevily flour, 4 shriveled potatoes, a twist of salt pork gone green at the edges, 17 mouths upstairs, 17 small bodies burning through the last of their fat. She had seen men die of worse on battlefields, but never children, never on her watch. She closed the door with the soft finality of a coffin lid and stepped outside to split kindling that wasn't there. The axe rang against frozen cottonwood until her palms bled inside the mittens. Night dropped fast, purple and merciless. Somewhere, a wolf answered the wind. That was the first night she saw the tracks. They circled the orphanage at a distance a rifle could still reach, deep, deliberate prints of a shod horse, coming from the north ridge, stopping, turning, coming again. Whoever rode that animal sat in his saddle a long time, watching the single lamp in the upstairs dormitory window. Then the tracks simply vanished into the pine line, as though the rider had been swallowed by the dark. Second night, same thing. Only now the prints came closer, close enough that the horse's breath had melted a circle of snow near the woodpile. Eleanor stood on the porch with the old Colt Navy in her apron pocket, hammer filed down for hair trigger, the way the cavalry surgeons taught her. She listened until her ears ached. Nothing moved but the snow itself, drifting sideways like ash from a burned world. Third night, she did not sleep. She sat by the stove with the children curled around her like puppies, their breath shallow. Little Winion, the quiet Lakota girl who had come to them 3 winters ago with a bullet furrow along her ribs, pressed her face into Eleanor's side and whispered something in her own tongue that sounded like prayer or warning. Just before dawn, the wind eased, and the world went so still that Eleanor heard the ice crack on the well. She stepped outside again, boots crunching. Fresh prints, deeper this time, the horse blown but not lamed. They stopped 20 yards from the kitchen door. In the middle of the circle stood a single object, a small bundle wrapped in rawhide, left upright in the snow like an offering. Eleanor approached slowly, revolver half drawn. The bundle was a chunk of pine firewood, split perfectly, the heartwood still bleeding pitch that smelled sharp and alive. Tied to it with a strip of red trade cloth was 1 eagle feather, black-tipped, barred with white. Lakota. Warrior's feather. She looked up toward the ridge. For 1 heartbeat, she thought she saw him, a tall figure on a paint horse, motionless against the tree line, buffalo robe dark with frost. Then the wind shifted, snow rose in a blinding curtain, and when it settled, there was nothing but empty white and the long track leading away north toward the high country where the agencies had pushed the last free bands. Eleanor carried the firewood inside, set it on the hearth, and stared at the feather until the stove's heat curled its quill. She knew what it meant. In the old days, a warrior left an eagle feather when he declared protection over a camp, a woman, or a child. It was a promise and a warning, both. She also knew who the Red Ridge Boys were, and that they had been seen watering their horses at Crow Agency 2 weeks back. Brant Miller still rode with 6 hard cases, still carried the Henry repeater he'd taken off a dead Cheyenne scout, still nursed the same poison hate that had burned 3 Lakota villages in '82. Eleanor fed the single chunk of pine into the stove. Flame caught quickly, blue and fierce. She watched it devour the feather, blackening the red cloth to ash. Whoever was out there had until the next snowfall to decide whose side the winter would take. She thumbed the Colt's hammer back to half-cock, slid it beneath her pillow, and waited for the 4th night. The 4th afternoon broke iron gray and still, the kind of quiet that comes before a mountain drops its hammer. Snow fell so thick it erased the horizon. The world narrowed to the yard in front of St. Helena and the black pines beyond. Eleanor was on her knees, scraping frost from the last potato, when the dogs went rigid, ears flat, not barking, just staring north. A single horse and rider came out of the white like a moving shadow. Paint stallion, raw-boned, ribs showing through the winter coat. The man rode without reins, one hand on the mane, the other resting on something across the pommel that might have been a rifle wrapped. And a blanket. Buffalo robe open to the wind, hair hanging in 2 thick braids under a battered cavalry campaign hat. He must have taken off a dead soldier somewhere. Beaded vest, fringed leggings crusted with ice. He looked carved from the storm itself. Behind him, dragged on rawhide ropes, came the sled. Low slung, wider than any ranch sled Eleanor had ever seen, piled high and covered with a patched canvas tarp that snapped and bellied in the wind. The load was so heavy the runners left furrows deep as a man's forearm. He stopped 10 yards from the porch. Snow hissed off the tarp. The paint blew steam and stamped once, then stood. The rider swung down without hurry, boots hitting the ground solid as judgment. Tall, maybe 6'3", shoulders wide enough to block the light. Face cut sharp by wind and grief, cheekbones high, a scar running from left ear to the corner of his mouth, like someone had tried to erase him and failed. He looked straight at Eleanor, eyes black and unreadable, and spoke in English, roughened by Lakota cadence. Children burn wood tonight, or they don't wake up tomorrow. No greeting, no threat, just a fact, cold as the iron bit in the horse's mouth. Eleanor's hand slid toward the Colt inside her apron, but something in the way he stood, loose yet ready, told her the gesture was already seen and weighed. She let her hand fall. He walked to the sled, untied the ropes with fingers that never shook despite the cold, and pulled the tarp back in one motion. Firewood first. Pine and cedar split perfectly, stacked like cordwood in a fort. Then burlap sacks, yellow cornmeal, jerked elk, pemmican wrapped in gut. A whole hindquarter of venison still rimmed with frost. Blankets, thick Hudson's Bay, 4-point. Children's moccasins lined with rabbit fur, a bolt of red trade cloth, and on top, like someone had placed it there last, a small rawhide bag that rattled softly, wooden toys inside. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs, enough to keep 17 children alive until spring breakup, more than enough. The warrior began unloading without asking leave, carrying armloads to the porch as if the weight were nothing. Each step deliberate, boots punching through the crust. Snow clung to his braids. When the first load thumped onto the boards, the upstairs window flew open and small faces appeared, eyes huge, mouths open but silent, afraid the vision would vanish. He made 6 trips. On the last, he set down a bundle wrapped in doeskin and looked at Eleanor for the first time since speaking. "You carried a child through snow once," he said, voice low, almost lost under the wind. Bullet in her side. 3 winters passed. Red Ridge boys on your heels. The world tilted. Eleanor saw it again. The girl limp across her shoulders, blood freezing on her habit, muzzle flashes behind them in the dark, her own breath sobbing white. "I thought she died," Eleanor whispered. "She lived." He touched the scar on his cheek, the one that pulled when he spoke. "Because of you." He did not offer his hand. Lakota warriors did not shake hands with women, especially nuns. Instead, he placed his right fist over his heart. Brief. Final. "Name given to me is Tasunka Wikasa. The girl you carried is Winyan. She is here." The question hung between them like a blade. Eleanor found her voice. "Inside. Warm. She never told us her father's name." A flicker crossed his face. Pain or pride. Impossible to tell. Then it was gone. "Tonight the fire burns," he said. "Tomorrow we speak of debts." He turned back to the sled, pulled the tarp tight, and tied it down with rawhide that snapped like rifle shots in the cold. The paint waited, patient as stone. Tasunka Wikasa swung up, gathered the reins, and looked once more toward the upstairs window, where a small, dark-haired girl now stood alone, hand pressed to the glass. He raised 2 fingers to his lips, a silent promise across the snow. Then he wheeled the paint and was gone, swallowed by the storm as cleanly as he had come, the empty sled runners singing behind him. Eleanor stood in the sudden quiet, snow settling on her lashes, the porch piled high with salvation. She felt the weight of the colt against her thigh and knew, with the certainty of a woman who had buried too many, that the winter had only begun to bite. The stove roared like it had been starved for years. For the first time in weeks, the children ate until their bellies hurt. Thick cornmeal mush swimming in elk fat, strips of jerky passed hand to hand, tin cups of hot water sweetened with a finger of molasses Tasunka Wikasa had left in a small stone jar. They fell asleep in piles, boots still on, faces smeared and shining. Eleanor barred the door, banked the fire high, and motioned the Lakota warrior to the single chair opposite her. The room smelled of pine smoke, wet wool, and something older, gun oil and blood that never quite washes out. He sat without removing the buffalo robe. Snow melted from his braids and dripped onto the puncheon floor. She broke the silence first. 3 winters ago, the Rosebud Road, I was riding dispatch for Fort Keogh when we hit the tail end of your people running south. Red Ridge boys were burning everything that moved. I found her under a dead pony, gut shot, half frozen. I cut the saddle cinch, threw her across my shoulders, and ran till my lungs bled. Tasunka Wikasa stared into the flames. I followed the blood trail for 2 days, found the pony, found the boys laughing around a fire. They said the child was finished. I believed them. His voice dropped. I rode north to die. The agencies wouldn't take a man who had no family left, so I kept riding. Eleanor poured coffee thick as axle grease into 2 tin cups. She woke up on the 3rd day, asking for Ina in a whisper. I brought her here, told the sister she was Navajo. Half-truth is safer than whole lies in this country. She never spoke your name. He turned the cup in scarred hands. Winyan was 5 winters. Her mother died at the greasy grass when the soldiers came. After that, it was only us. Then the boys came again, looking for horses, for women, for anything they could break. I put her on a pony and told her to ride south. I stayed to slow them. He touched the scar that split his cheek. They slowed me instead. The fire popped. A log collapsed in a shower of sparks. He leaned forward. I tracked every mission, every agency, every white trader who might have seen a Lakota child with a fresh bullet wound. Nothing. Then last month, a Crow horse trader told me of a nun at St. Helena who kept a silent little girl with eyes like mine. I came to see if the dead could walk. Eleanor felt the years collapse into the space between them. She's upstairs, second cot on the left. He closed his eyes a moment, the way a man does when pain finally finds the right nerve. Outside, the wind had dropped to a predator's prowl. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked under ice, sharp as a rifle shot. Tasunka Wikasa rose in one motion. Brant Miller drinks at Crow Agency. He saw my sled tracks 2 days ago. He remembers the village he burned. He remembers the woman who stole his prize. He will come when the moon is down. Eleanor's hand found the Colt on the table. Let him. The Lakota looked at her then, really looked, the way one fighter measures another across a fire. I brought wood and meat, he said. Now, I bring something heavier. He drew a skinning knife from his belt, long as a forearm, and laid it beside her revolver. Tomorrow night, we finish what started on the Rosebud. He moved to the window, pushed the shutter a finger's width, and studied the dark like it owed him money. If this story is already carving its mark on you, the way old scars itch before a storm, do me a favor. Tap subscribe. There are nights ahead colder than this one, and I'd hate for you to miss how the fire answers back. Eleanor thumbed the Colt cylinder open, checked the loads by firelight, and snapped it shut. Upstairs, a child coughed once, then settled. Down her, the two people who had both lost everything sat with weapons between them, and a debt older than the snow outside. The stove settled into a steady roar. Outside, the pines began to whisper the names of the dead. The moon never rose. A black ceiling of cloud pressed the snow into a dull, corpse-white glow that turned every shadow into a threat. The temperature dropped until the air itself cracked like old rawhide. Inside St. Helena, the children slept two to a cot, sharing breath. Eleanor and Tasunka Wikasa did not sleep. They waited in the dark kitchen, stove banked low, so the chimney gave no betraying spark. The Colt lay on the table between them, cylinder full, grease wiped from the nipples. Beside it, the long skinning knife caught the faint red of the coals. Outside, the dogs had gone quiet hours ago, an absence louder than any barking. At 3 a.m, the first horse nickered somewhere down the valley, the sound muffled by snow, but unmistakable. Then another. Boots on crust. Metal on metal. 7 riders fanning out, slow, savoring the hunt. Brant Miller's voice drifted up the slope, lazy and poisonous. Evening, sister. Time to pay the ferryman. A match flared. A lantern bloomed under the pines, throwing long red claws across the yard. The riders sat their saddles in a half ring, rifles across their pommels, faces half lit and hungry. Brant held the lantern high enough for Eleanor to see the old burn scar that ran from his hairline to his jaw. Souvenir from the greasy grass fight he never forgave. He nudged his horse forward until the animal's breath steamed against the porch rail. Got something that belongs to me, he called. Little red-skinned bitch I put a bullet in 3 years back. Heard she's still breathing. That's thieving, sister. Tasunka Wikasa stepped out first, unarmed, hands empty and open. Snow hissed off his shoulders. He walked down the steps into the lantern light, like a man walking into deep water. Brant grinned. Well, hell, look who crawled out of whatever hole he was dying in. Tasunka stopped 10 paces from the horses. Leave, right out now. No blood tonight. Brant spat. Only blood tonight is yours, breed. He jerked his chin. 2 riders swung down, carbines ready. Then the front door creaked wider. A small Navajo girl, Maria, 9 winters, and all bone, was shoved into the light by a gloved hand. A Bowie knife rested against her throat, hard enough to bead red. "Quill or no quill," Brant said, "I always collect." Tasunka's knees buckled as if someone had cut the tendons. He sank slowly into the snow, palms open on his thighs, the posture of absolute surrender. The sight froze every man in the yard. Even the horses stood still. Brant laughed, the sound wet and triumphant. "That's it. On your knees where you belong." Memory slammed into the Lakota like a club. The burning lodges, his wife's body dragged by the hair, his sons shot for sport. The smell of scorched hide and burning hair rose in his nostrils again. His shoulders shook once. Eleanor moved. She had slipped out the side window, while every eye was on the kneeling warrior. Now she ghosted along the log wall, habit tucked up, bare feet silent in the crusted snow. The cold bit like acid, but pain kept her sharp. 10 yards. 5. Close enough to smell Brant's sour whiskey breath and the horse's sweat. The man holding Maria never saw her. Eleanor rose behind Brant's left shoulder, Colt already cocked. The muzzle kissed the base of his skull just below the hat brim. The explosion was flat and enormous in the closed valley, a single thunderclap that punched snow from the pines. Brant's hat jumped forward. The lantern shattered in his hand. He toppled sideways, dead before his boot cleared the stirrup. Brains and blood steaming pink on the snow. For one heartbeat, the world stopped. Then hell tore loose. Tasunka came off his knees like a mountain lion, knife flashing from his sleeve. He buried it to the hilt in the nearest rider's thigh, twisted, ripped sideways. The man screamed and fell. Rifles roared, muzzle flashes strobing white. Eleanor dropped to one knee, fanned the Colt left-handed the way the Arizona Rangers taught her when nuns weren't watching. 2 more saddles emptied. The remaining 3 wheeled their horses and flogged them into the trees, sparks flying from shod hooves on ice. Their yells faded into the pines, like coyotes that suddenly remembered bigger teeth. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the hiss of snow on hot iron and Maria's thin sobbing. Tasunka stood over Brant's body, chest heaving, knife dripping. Blood speckled his face like war paint. He looked at Eleanor across the lantern's dying glow, eyes wild, then slowly lowered the blade. Eleanor thumbed fresh rounds into the Colt, with fingers already going numb. The smell of burnt powder hung thick as incense. Inside, children began to cry. The debt had been paid in full, and the snow kept falling, already covering the red. Dawn came thin and merciless, the color of a fresh knife blade. The yard looked like a butcher's floor, 3 bodies stiff in the snow, blood frozen into black glass, horses long gone with the survivors. Crows already circled high, waiting for the living to leave. Eleanor and Tasunka worked without words. They dragged the dead to the ravine behind the chapel, rolled them over the edge, and let the mountain take its own. Snow would finish the burial by noon. The children watched from the windows, silent, learning early what the frontier taught best. Some debts are settled with lead, and the ground never asks questions. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the yard was swept clean, the crimson scrubbed away with lye and pine boughs. Only the bullet holes in the log walls and the lingering smell of powder said anything had happened. Tasunka stood at the porch rail, staring north as if expecting riders that would never come again. His hands shook, not from cold. Eleanor brought him coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe. He took it without looking. "They will send more," he said finally. "Brant had brothers. The agencies will call it murder. Soldiers will ride." "Let them," Eleanor answered. We have 17 witnesses who saw evil come calling and get sent to hell." He turned then, and for the first time, she saw the exhaustion carved deep under his eyes, the kind that went bone deep and older than grief. Inside, the children had gathered around the stove, quieter than she had ever known them. Winyan sat apart on the lowest stair, knees drawn up, staring at the door as though it might open and swallow her. Tasunka crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched in front of her. He reached into the pouch at his belt and drew out a string of elk bone beads, white and polished, threaded on sinew the color of old blood. A protector's charm, the kind a father ties on a child before the first hunt or the last battle. He held it out. Winyan's eyes, black and huge, lifted to his. Recognition hit her like a slap. She whispered one word, cracked and small. "Ina." Then she was in his arms, face buried in the buffalo robe that still smelled of gun smoke and pine. His big hand cupped the back of her head as if she were made of glass. The sound he made was not a sob. It was the sound a mountain makes when something inside finally breaks loose after 1,000 years. Eleanor felt her own throat close. She turned away to give them the only privacy the room allowed. The days that followed were hard, practical, and strangely gentle. Tasunka stayed. He patched the bullet holes with pine pitch and rawhide, cut a winter's worth of firewood from the deadfall up the canyon, and taught the boys to read sign in the snow: wolf, lynx, man. He showed the girls how to tan deer hide soft enough for cradle boards that would never be needed here. But the skill itself was a gift. At night, he carved small horses from cottonwood, joints pegged with willow, manes flowing like wind. The children fought over who slept, with which one under their pillows. He built a small annex off the kitchen. 1 room, earth floor, a tiny window facing east, so the morning light would strike the bundle of sweetgrass he hung from the rafter. There, he kept Winyan's cradle board from her baby days, the beaded moccasins her mother had made, a lock of black hair tied with red yarn. Sacred things. Private things. Spring breakup came suddenly and violently that year. The creek behind the orphanage roared bank full, ice booming like artillery. Snow slid from the roof in wet avalanches. The high passes opened. One April evening, when the first green blades of grass pushed through the mud, Tasunka stood on the porch with his war bag slung and the paint stallion saddled at the rail. The children clustered around his legs like foals. Winyan held his hand so tight that her knuckles were white. Eleanor came out, drying her hands on a rag. The silence stretched, full of things neither wanted to say. Finally, he spoke, voice rough from disuse. "The agencies will come looking sooner or later. A Lakota with a white mission is trouble. They understand how to finish." Eleanor nodded once. "Then we will be in trouble," they remember. He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful in his eyes. Then he swung up into the saddle. Winyan started forward, but he leaned down and touched her cheek. "I ride ahead to clear the way," he told her in Lakota. "You stay. Learn. Grow strong. When the cottonwoods leaf out again, I will come back. This is our winter camp now." He looked at Eleanor last. "I thought I was bringing fire and meat. You gave me back my heart." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "You gave us back our lives. The debt is even." He lifted 2 fingers to his forehead in farewell, wheeled the paint, and rode north up the valley. The children watched until he was only a dark stitch against the white, then a speck, then gone. But every year after, when the first snow closed the passes, hoofprints appeared again in the yard, deep and deliberate, leading to the porch. And every spring they led away again, lighter. The mountain kept its own counsel. St. Helena kept its children. And somewhere on the high plains, A Lakota warrior rode with a string of wooden horses in his saddlebag, heading home to a place that finally had a door he no longer needed to knock on. The snow has settled, the fire is low, and somewhere out there, a paint horse still follows the old trails home. If this story of debts paid in blood and love, repaid in silence, struck you hard, drop a comment below. What hit you deepest? The gunshot in the dark, the eagle feather in the stove, or the father's hand finally finding his daughter after 3 lost winters? Tell me where you're listening from. Cowboy campfire, city subway, or midnight kitchen table. Your words keep these stories riding. Until the next storm rolls down the Bighorn and we gather again around the same fire. Ride safe, keep your powder dry, and I'll see you on the trail.